Welcome to Babblecom 5. Let me just begin by saying I am not Space Doc. I say again, I am not Space Doc, but I do love Space Doc stuff. There's a channel on YouTube, for those unfamiliar, which deals with analysis of space battles, space combat in general, particular starships, you name it, it's on the channel basically. So do go and have a look if you're not familiar. However, they've never actually looked at Severed Dreams, and I have always found Severed Dreams to be one of the best realised battles that I've seen that involves sort of proper Newtonian physics. And yes, it's from the late 1990s, so the graphics may not be bleeding edge, but they probably made the PCs rendering them at the time bleed, because they had to do a phenomenal number of extra special effects shots for this episode. And it's an episode of a normal production run TV show, and they've had an incredible number of space combat shots in this one episode, including to stuff we probably just hadn't seen before on TV. It was really incredible stuff. And I also discovered just re-listening, or perhaps listening for the first time, to JMS's commentary on this episode on the DVD set that I have, that this was a Hugo Award winning episode, and it beat out Star Trek First Contact, for God's sake. Really remarkable on a TV show budget, but of course this is what Babylon 5 did so well. It took the budget they had, threw it at renderings, and enabled them to do stuff like this, which they couldn't have hoped to have done on their budget using real models of ships. So I just want to run through the various sort of CGI space shots that we see in this episode, just to give you an idea of what was going on and my thoughts on it, really. And maybe one day Space Doc will actually do this battle themselves, and then they can they can give you a more informed view with all the necessary stats and far prettier graphics than I can manage, because I'm basically just going to run one of my good old slideshows behind me talking on this. So the situation is, for those unfamiliar, that basically there is a civil war about to kick off on Earth, and the incumbent president, President Clark, has declared martial law. And in response to that declaration, various Earth colonies, Mars included, have basically said no thank you. And as a result, Earth Force, which is the military forces of Earth, including those in space, has splintered. And some ships have remained loyal to the president. Other ships have viewed his orders as unlawful and illegal, and have therefore chosen to break away from Central Command and go their own way and support the breakaway colonies. And the episode begins with an Omega-class destroyer called the Alexander. They tend to be quite Greek names, sort of Greek heroic names, running from a smaller Hyperion cruiser called the Clarkstown, which apparently has been hounding it for some time. So the Alexander is already damaged at this point, and it is using its Star Furies, which includes standard Star Furies and the more advanced Thunderbolt atmosphere capable variant, which we hadn't seen before this episode, in fact. And they are basically acting as a sort of a shield, because there aren't energy shields in Babylon 5. So this big Alexander cruiser is running from the Clarkstown in normal space, and the commander of the Alexander is reluctant to open fire on the Clarkstown, but basically the Clarkstown scores a hit on its rotating section, or most of it, in the sense that all of its fighters actually takes the hit for it, but it still leaves a fairly significant dent in its hull as a result. And basically one more hit like that and they'll lose their rotating section and goes 0G, which will not help their ability to fight. So in the end, the Alexander's captain relents and orders the rear guns, yes, a spaceship with rear guns. Pretty sensible, isn't it? Nice. And basically the rear guns open fire on the Clarkstown, whose forward interceptors are down. And we see the Clarkstown taking a direct hit from this beam laser amidships, and that is sufficient to finish the Clarkstown, which leaves the Alexander free to recover its fighters before entering hyperspace. It could have jumped out by itself before now, but if it did that, it would have lost its fighters because they can't form their own jump points into hyperspace. So although some of them might have been able to scramble and use its jump point, the odds are it would have lost most of its fighters, which the captain didn't find palatable. So they had to use their anti-capital ship weapon to kill off the Clarkstown before they could jump in order to preserve their fighters. So they do that. That ship then escapes to Babylon 5 space, and there is news that Clark has issued orders for the Mars domes to be bombed by Thunderbolt class Star Furies. And again, this is the first time we've seen these new Star Furies up close, and they're capable of working in atmospheres, which is something we haven't seen before. And we see these Star Furies deploy air-to-ground missiles and attack the Mars domes. So the Alexander is now parked outside of Babylon 5. We get a nice shot combining the two of them, so you can see the sort of size differential. And we also see then a Minbari flyer piloted by Delenn leaving the station through the local jump gate. And as she's doing so, another Earth cruiser, which is a rebel cruiser, jumps in. And this one is captained by a lady called Hiroshi. And this is the Churchill. So we now have the Churchill and the Alexander in local Babylon 5 space. And the Churchill brings news that Earth-loyal cruisers are coming en masse to try and take Babylon 5. So Sheridan puts the whole station on a state of combat readiness. We see Star Furies being launched from the station's Cobra bays, which I really only noticed when I looked at this episode closely, but I think that they can launch 7 fighters at a time. And there are I want to say there were about 4 squadrons, I think, on the station. So they launch out into local space, and we then see this attack force of Earth loyal ships coming in, and it consists of 2 Hyperion. I'm going to call them cruisers. That might be inaccurate. They might be destroyers, and we also see a further 2 Omega class destroyers like the Churchill and the Alexander come in as well, and they're the Agrippa and the Roanoke. And we then see that the Churchill and Alexander launch their fighters in readiness for the battle to come. And so the interesting thing about this battle, to my mind, is that Babylon 5 is primarily a civilian trading hub. It is not designed to go into battle, although it does have point defences, which you'll see soon. But fundamentally, we have 2 destroyers who have their backs to the station, and we have multiple hostile ships coming in, but who want to take the station in one piece. So they are actually pretty hamstrung, because they can't fire towards the station in any sort of particularly meaningful way, because the stray shot will actually risk blowing the station up, which includes 250,000 civilians of various species. So you're going to upset quite a few people if that happens. So on the one hand, we have this defending force who can act relatively freely, but the attacking force has a particular goal in mind, and that's quite difficult, because obviously the attacking force wants to preserve its goal, but it's also got to defend itself. So it's a really interesting tactical situation, because there are also a lot of fighters zipping about with real-world physics applying to them, so it's a real hairball. So we see the 2 fleets closing on one another. We have the combined squadrons from the Churchill and the Alexander with the Babylon 5 Star Fury squadrons closing on the fighters that accompanied the enemy fleet in hyperspace, and of course can be launched from their own fighter bays. So there are a lot of independent ships flying around, and you can make out in the centre of this shot that there is a breaching pod in the mix as well, and that is what the enemy forces are going to use to try and get Marines onto the station. Now, what we don't see in the course of this engagement, and in fairness, they couldn't do it all. Realistically, they could not do it all. But there are these 2 Hyperion class cruisers in the mix in the Loyal fleet. We don't see what happens to them. So that's the one thing I would say about the battle. My assumption would be that because they're not as heavily armed as the Omegas, I think that they would have been the focus fire target of the defending Star Furies. So I think the Star Furies would have gone for them because they lack point defences, and they also lack their own. I'm guessing they would lack their own assigned fighter squadrons, because I think they can only carry a couple of Star Furies each. They're not big on fighter bays, the Hyperions. So I think that they were taken down by the various fighters, who then turned their attention to the Omegas. So Sheridan orders his forces not to fire first. So basically, he's giving the other side every opportunity not to start the battle, but they do. And we see Star Furies immediately sort of exchanging fire with one another. Few lost from each side, and then everyone just sort of breaks up and attacks. And the capital ships start to close range on each other, and they also exchange fire with each other from range. And they do have the ability to intercept each other's fire, which they do. But ultimately, they are gonna end up mixing it up. So the fighters are obviously aiming to get near enough to the Omegas to do strafing runs on them. The station's defense grid opens fire as well on the enemy fighters that are trying to get in close to the station. So again, the enemy fighters can't really attack the defense grid as such. They can't attack the station directly, but the station is able to use point defences to attack them, and they are whittled down somewhat by the station's point defences. So this carries on for a little while, and both sides are taking hits. The commander of the Alexander decides to move in closer, and we get a nice shot of the Alexander's engines opening up so that it can close range on one of the enemy Omegas. The point defences carry on firing. They're doing a pretty useful job, but the breaching pod does make contact with the station's hull, and so that gives Sheridan another headache, because the security forces internally then have to deal with the consequences of that. Now we also see very, very sensibly a pair of enemy Thunderbolts actually trying to hit the command centre of Babylon 5 itself, which makes perfect sense. It's away from the civilian areas, it's exposed on the docking port end of the station. However, it is not undefended, and there is a point defence sort of chain gun, which was one of the upgraded systems from the episode Gropos, and it successfully tags the incoming Furies and eventually destroys them, although the command centre does take a little bit of shrapnel as a result, because obviously the ships are travelling in its direction, so the shrapnel is going to keep moving in that direction unless something affects it. But the blast doors on the command centre do holes, and it's okay. Now, the next shots get more interesting. We see that Ivanova is conducting some strafing runs on one of the enemy ships, but then we see that the Churchill, commanded by Hiroshi, it's dead in the water. It's aflame, with flames obviously being generated by its atmosphere leaking into space, and Hiroshi decides that there's only one thing that she can now do, because her ship is basically a dead loss at this point, and it's going to detonate. So what she chooses to do is ram one of the opponent's ships. Now this is where things get a little bit confused in the episode. She rams the Churchill into the Roanoke, but Sheridan had previously ordered a firing solution put together for the Roanoke. Now, the way in which the Churchill hits the Roanoke seemed to suggest that the Roanoke itself would probably then be out of the fight. Now, that's not necessarily a certainty, I think, but it's a pretty solid hit to the neck of the Roanoke. And although the command centre isn't in the forward section, it's actually in the rotating section because it has gravity, I would imagine that would basically take the ship out of the fight. So what we then see is various shots of the other enemy Omega, the Agrippa, being hit left, right and centre, actually, because we see that Ivanova was engaged in combat next to it when she was distracted by the Churchills crashing into the Roanoke, and her Fury actually smashes into the side of Agrippa after she ejects from it. We also see the Alexander completing its closing manoeuvre, and it's closed on the Agrippa, so its forward batteries fire into the side of the Agrippa and cause a sort of almost like a sort of a hairline fracture in its neck. And what's interesting then is that the Babylon 5's defense grid then opens fire at long range, so it's timing on target, which means it's trying to fire in such a way that all of its shots hit the target at the same time. And the target that it's hitting is the Agrippa. It's actually quite difficult to make it out in the episode, but there is a screenshot here where you can just about see the purr at the end of Agrippa, and that's what the defense grid was aiming at. Now, what's puzzling about that is that the dialogue at this point has Sheridan talking to the Roanoke about surrendering and talked about the Roanoke being targeted by the defense grid, but it's the Agrippa that gets hit by it, and it's the Agrippa that then subsequently blows up. Now, I can only assume that this was either a sort of a CGI error or a script error. And I know that they literally had, would you believe, an hour left to go before the show was due to air. And that was when they got the final copy of the episode out to the uplink to actually put it out for the network to be able to broadcast it. So they were that close to the wire on this because of all the shots that they were trying to fit in. So, it's no surprise that things got had the potential to get muddled. So at this point then what we have is something of a draw, in the sense that both the Churchill and the Roanoke are out. So that's one of the enemy Omegas gone, one of the the rebel, if you like, Omega's gone as well. The Alexander still seems to be pretty functional. Has taken some hits undoubtedly, but is still quite functional. The two Hyperions appear to have been dealt with somewhere somehow, and the Agrippa has also now been taken out in the final moments. So we assume that means that Babylon 5's won, because the breaching pod occupants have also been largely dealt with. However, all is not so straightforward, because Babylon 5 has taken hull damage itself, so it's in a pretty poor state of repair. And just as they think that they've got on top of the situation, more Earth loyal ships jump in through the local jump gate, which for some reason they can't shut down. I'm not quite sure why that would be, but even the original force came into the jump gate as well. It's a curious thing, but maybe we just can't override them. And again, the station finds itself facing two Omega class cruisers and probably at least two Hyperions, I think. And so, in its current state, it's got absolutely zero chance of taking these guys on successfully, because it's outnumbered in Omegas and there's another Hyperion in the mix. And it's at this point that Sheridan is told that there are 4 new jump points opening right on top of the station. And basically he assumes that it's more Earth ships coming in. But happily, for all concerned, they're not Earth ships, they're Minbari ships. Because Delenn has been out telling the Grey Council what's what, and she's brought back reinforcements with her. So 3 Minbari Charlene class war cruisers jump in, along with the White Star, which Delenn is in the captain's seat of, and basically she makes it very clear to the Earth reinforcements that they're not in the best place to be, because the only captain who's ever survived combat with the Minbari is behind her, and they are in front of her. So if they value their lives, they should be somewhere else. And lo and behold, the Earth reinforcements very wisely turn tail, activate their jump engines, and jump out of dodge. And that resolves the situation, because they know damn well they don't have a cat in hell's chance against Minbari war cruisers, especially not 3 of them, given that there's still an Earth warship active against them as well. So far more than they were bargaining for, basically. And they leave, and we see some nice shots of the cruisers and the White Star running past and around Babylon 5 to sort of hammer home the point that they're there to guard the place. And we also then see some final shots of the Alexander parked next to the station before it leaves to draw fire away from the station. So it's a really logical, well thought through engagement, because it's apparent that if you can get onto the side of an Omega, it can't defend itself quite so well from the side as it can from a sort of a forward facing threat or a rear facing threat, which I think is why the Alexander gets onto the side aspect of the Agrippa before it opens fire on it, because it knows that it can't intercept that angle of shot. And as I say, we've got all the Furies flying around, we've got the defense squad firing, and the defense squad is doing exactly what it should do, and it's shown that it is capable with focused fire of holding its own against the capital ship. And none of this is news to you if you're a fan of the series, because we know that it is capable of taking on capital ships, because we've seen it before with the Nine and the Centauri, where it's had to defend the station against aggressors or just sort of incidental fire. So the thing is, we'd never seen this before. It's all very well thought out. It's really sensible tactics. There's a lot at stake here, because this is Earth versus Earth. This is an Earth civil war, basically. We're seeing spawn in Babylon 5's local space, and then we get this lovely late save from Delenn, which you don't really know is coming particularly, but it's a terrific piece, because it's quite emotional for all concerned. The station's gone from trying to prevent a war with the Minbari to having the Minbari save it from a civil war, which is an immense turnaround over the course of sort of 2.5 years of the show. So it's a really impressive episode. It moves really quickly. The musical score behind it all is terrific. And JMS said in his commentary, at times they actually turned off the music. They turned off the sound effects for sort of the handguns firing on the station, and just let the score go over the top of it completely, because Christopher Frankie's music does such a great job of sort of telling the story for you, basically. So by far and away one of the sort of the standout episodes of the series as a whole for me, because we just hadn't seen this before, and it all made sense. You'll notice that the enemy fighters have a little bit of sort of pinky colouring on their thruster pods, which I think was intended to distinguish them from the Babylon 5 and the other allied fighters, so you have you don't get too confused about what's going on, because obviously at the end of the day they are identical fighters, and there are thunderbolts on both sides, because the Alexander and the Churchill have thunderbolts on board, which of course the other Earth destroyers will have now as well, but the station never had thunderbolts up until this point, and after this the station does inherit some thunderbolts from the Churchill, because obviously the Churchill's not around to take them back on board, so they're gifted to the station. In terms of sort of weaponry involved here, also we see, I think it's I'm guessing it's sort of pulse weapons and the sort of the big PPGs that the Star Furies use as beam weapons on the Omega Cruisers and the Hyperions, but they also use I think sort of plasma-based pulse guns as a sort of point defense weapon on their own part. There are also point defense cannons, smaller beam cannons, I believe, on the spine, and I'm going to get this wrong, ventral side of the Omegas towards their back. You can see it in one of the early shots of the Alexander. You can sort of make that out more clearly, but I don't think we see them used in this episode, but you do see them in other episodes. So yeah, I mean, it's just a superb piece of space combat. It's really well orchestrated. It's very believable because, you know, there's no sort of reset button. You know, Babylon 5 is taking damage, and that's clearly going to need repairing. And, you know, they're using fire extinguishers in the command center just to put stuff out whilst they're trying to keep it together. It's just really, really well done, and you know, to my mind, it was by far and away the most convincing space battle, because you see these sort of one-on-ones in Star Trek where it's two capital ships slugging it out basically, but here we've got the fighters in the mix and they're using real-world physics, so it's not like X-Wings going up against TIE fighters. You know, and fundamentally I think it's humans versus humans. It's not obviously kind of humans versus aliens, or, you know, sort of good guys versus bad guys. It's very evenly matched forces, because they obviously, you know, until the Minbari get involved, the tech is exactly the same. So it's all down to how do you manage to tactically overwhelm the opposing force. Unfortunately here, of course, the opposing force has basically got one hand tied behind its back because it can't go all out. You know, if it was just a question of destroying the station, they could do that really, really easily because they want the station. And that's what makes it such an interesting fight, because they want the station in one piece, which means they can't go too overboard on it. But by the same token, they've also got to survive long enough to be able to raid, you know, to board the station and or destroy its defenders. But of course, the defenders have the advantage that they have the station helping it and in support. So they've basically got a good solid sort of 3 flights worth of Star Furies versus whatever Furies the 2 Omegas brought with them, because the Hyperions don't particularly bring Furies. So once you've got a numerical advantage to start with, you're doing pretty well. And also Babylon 5 is bringing in sort of capital ship level firepower as well. So you've effectively got 3 capital ships versus maybe 4 capital ships, but you've got more Furies. So it's a really, really interesting battle, and it's incredible that they managed to cram all this into one episode. You know, and it probably doesn't run for more than sort of 5 or 6 minutes, but there's just so much going on. It's really, really remarkable. I mean, I think you will find it on YouTube. I mean, I try and avoid using video because obviously it causes copyright issues, but you will find this on YouTube split into a couple of parts, I think, and it's actually I think the HD version of it is out there as well. So do have a look at it, because if you're not familiar with it, it's well worth a look. And you know, if Space Dock would care to give this a crack, then I think they should go for it, because I'm sure their view of it will be really interesting, because they've probably got a slightly broader general knowledge of this stuff than I have from the various shows that they've watched, which are more modern than this. So it would be interesting to get their opinion on whether or not this actually sort of still holds up in this day and age in terms of what people are doing on the more modern shows. But I don't particularly see why it shouldn't, because I watched another review recently which basically said that even though the CGI on the show is a little bit dated now, it's not so terrible that it takes you out of the storyline itself. And I think that's a very, very fair comment. I don't think there is anything wrong with this CGI at all. I mean, yeah, fine, you might get more detailed textures and all that sort of good stuff these days, but there's nothing wrong with how it's done here. I mean, it's, for my mind, suspension of disbelief is part of watching science fiction, and there isn't actually a great deal of suspension I need to be doing here, because it's pretty bloody solid. So I'll be really interested in comments on this one. I don't generally do this sort of off the cuff kind of tactical analysis type of video, but Severed Dreams is a particular favourite of mine. So I just thought it might be a bit fun just to show you the various CGI shots of the ships involved and just run through what's actually going on in the battle a little bit, because I just think it's one of those really, really interesting ones. If, like me, you're a bit of a starship nerd, it's it's right up there in terms of favourite battles, has to be said. So yeah, let me know in the comments, obviously, if you've enjoyed, and do please try and save my my Lego Ideas Eagle Transporter from doom, because it's at time of recording it's got about 100 days left, and I'm struggling even to get it to 1999 votes, which I quite like to do. Just personal thing, I suppose. But anyway, I shall leave you there, and yeah, I was going to try and do another episode tonight, but I've already got one in the bag for this week, so I'm not panicking too much. But at some point, I want to try and get my my buffer up a little bit, especially as Christmas is not that far off now. But anyway, I shall leave you there, and I'll join you in the comments if there are any. Cheers for now.